want to take a moment, a rather elongated moment actually, to talk about something that I'm passionate about. Can you guess what it is? Can you? I'll give you 3 guesses. Before I took to refurbishing, recovering, restoring, whatever, parasols, I started out as a collector. I still am a collector. And do you know what one of the main appeals of collecting parasols can be? Finding really neat original examples. This brings up a question, something that has come to my attention at workshops and through questions that I've been asked online. That question being, what qualifies a parasol as one that is a good candidate to be recovered? Because I've been presented pieces that I've looked at and I've had to find a polite way of saying, why would you recover that? I've taken a sampling of parasols from my collection and divided them into groups so that we can go over them and I can talk about what, in my opinion, makes a good candidate to recover and what doesn't and why. Some of these may look like they would be good candidates to recover, but when you get into it, they really aren't, and I personally would never touch them, and I'll get into that when we start looking at them. I approach parasol recovering from the perspective of a lifelong antique collector and as someone who's been involved in historic preservation. I've been involved off and on with different house museums in my area for the past 15 years, and eventually I hope to show you some of these places I've been involved with in the future. Personally, I look at restoring parasols like one would look at restoring a historic house, or evaluating a piece of antique furniture. Going with the metaphor of the historic house, there are some things in that house, or there are some houses that you would not touch, and there are some places that you have no option but to completely gut renovate. As much as I actively dislike that. Also, as of recording this video, the only thing that I really sew right now are the covers for these little parasols. I haven't really branched out into other costuming yet, although that is a plan in the future. I've never recovered anything to specifically match an ensemble, and it's important to note that in the 19th century, they really didn't do that either for the great majority of the parasols out there. Most parasols were selected to harmonize with an ensemble rather than to directly coordinate with them. So with all of that said, let's look at some parasols. The first thing I want to quickly address is how to handle a parasol. The first thing you do not want to do with an original piece is to force it open completely. Unless it's something that can definitely take the strain, like a cotton or a linen cover that is in absolutely pristine, strong condition. If it feels like it has any kind of weakness to it, do not try to open the cover completely. I always open a frame to the point where I get resistance and I stop, because forcing a cover all the way open, as someone has done with this, can cause a lot of damage to the original silk. And not kidding, if you were to send the piece to a professional textile conservator, that would be a very expensive conservation bill. So be kind to your parasols. The first group of parasols that we're going to be looking at are ones that I personally would never ever touch, because these pieces are in beautifully preserved condition with amazing silk, beautifully finished. These are the pieces that you cherish and never get a seam ripper near them because you will scare them. Our first parasol in this group is this circa 1810 folding parasol with baleen ribs and original linen cover. Now remember what I said about opening parasols all the way? That original linen cover is beautifully intact, only slightly bug bitten in certain places, but being that this is not only not silk and it is in strong condition, it's one of the only pieces that I can actually open all the way. And it also happens to be one of the oldest pieces in my entire collection. Funny how that works, isn't it? Its only issue, besides those few little
holes is that some of the seams need to be reinforced, as the thread is starting to give way. Thankfully, this doesn't extend to the linen. Something I love about this parasol is that 2 of the 8 cover panels are pieced. On silk covers, you'll often see a little fringe running around the cover at this point, and I have a feeling under that fringe is a piecing seam. The finishing of the panel along its edge is interesting as well, as it's held in place by 3 sets of stitches spaced out along the baseline. This is a construction technique that I can't say I've seen on any later piece in my collection. For all of these obvious reasons, the cover, the interesting construction, the really cute piecing, I will not be touching this piece ever. We move forward in the 19th century a little to our second piece in this first group, which is this circa 1840 walking parasol with faceted faux-grained handle, rattan ribs, pressed metal finial, and this most incredible figured silk cover. The silk on this cover is absolutely exquisite, and to me feels slightly earlier than the frame, probably having been made at some point in the 1830s, as the geometric diaper pattern on the ground and weirdly 1980s but at the same time fantastic ultra-geometric border of blue ombre figuring along the selvage feel very much in line with 1830s silks and printed cottons. Another great thing about this frame is the original closure, a bone button with woven flat silk cord, one of many ways parasols could be kept closed in the 19th century. Obviously, to find a silk like this today is an impossible feat, and this is nearly perfect, so it stays. Moving almost 20 years ahead in the 19th century, we come to this circa 1860 blonde wood folding carriage parasol with metal ribs, 2-layer fawn brown silk cover, and tied-on silk fringe. This cover, the only condition issue is the cotton thread degrading and giving way, is a rare survivor of an English patented 2-layer cover by a parasol manufacturer whose first name I forget, but I know his last name is Meyer, who patented this design in 1858. In my 15 years of collecting, I've only seen a small handful of examples of this style, and the fact that the silk is still strong and shows no signs of weakening along where the cover has creased in storage places this in our first group. If the seams were reinforced, it is probably one of the rare pieces that could be opened fully. Even still, I don't think I'll ever do that. The third piece in our first group is this circa 1870 ombrelle marquise with emerald green silk cover, ivory stem and handle, and baleen ribs. This particular piece is made by Parisian manufacturer Verdier. Verdier was probably the name in luxury French parasol manufacturing. There's not a lot of information about Verdier on the internet, however, from what I've been able to scrape together from my admittedly very shoddy French, this is what I've been able to figure out so far. Verdier was a family business established at some point in the 18th century, and they came to be known as the maker of parasols for royalty and aristocracy, a reputation earned from their workshop spaces being used as a shelter for fleeing French aristocrats on their flight from Paris to escape the guillotine during the French Revolution. By the time this parasol was made around 1870, other Parisian manufacturers like Cazal and Dupuis had earned their own places in the very highest echelons of French parasol making. However, Verdier was still one of the most exclusive. Some of Verdier's pieces were made from semi-precious stones with gold and silver mounts set with diamonds and precious stones. This piece, however, is one of their more sedate examples, but there was a time that I was able to handle one of their very best surviving pieces, and I'm almost ashamed to admit it, but tears may have been shed. This emerald green ribbed silk taffeta is nearly perfect after 150 years, and its vibrancy would be hard to equal today. Plus, this cover shows the fineness of cover finishing that you saw on this level of manufacturing. The outer cover and lining is sewn together with the smallest, nearly invisible whip stitching I have ever seen. To me, it has sentimental value because this was a birthday present from my fiance, and it's not every birthday that you open a box and in it is a parasol bearing the name of one of the best manufacturers in the 19th century that you have coveted for years. For all of these reasons, I will be keeping this piece as is.
Our second group of parasols consists of pieces that most people would look at and assume that they would be good candidates to recover. However, I look at these pieces and I would never ever touch them, reason being that you will never ever find a silk that will come even close to matching the original silks that are on these frames. When you do find silks that look like they could work, those silks are usually incredibly expensive for most people, including me.
Although there was that one parasol cover I saved up 2 years for the silk to do it, and it was worth it. The first piece in our second group is the circa 1837 rattan-ribbed ombrelle marquise with sprigged silk cover and faux-grained handle. This is an important piece in my collection as it represents the beginning of the decorative, tiny parasols that would come to define the fashionable parasol of the mid-19th century. Prior to this, parasols were, for the most part, larger. The delicately sprigged figuring and almond coloration of the silk is something that is nothing at all like what you would find out in most fabric stores today. For these reasons, I want to leave it alone. We move forward about 13 years and we have our second piece in this second group. This circa 1850 white painted baleen ribbed folding parasol with warp printed Spitalfields silk cover and bone finial. Today a suburb of London, Spitalfields was the center of Huguenot refugee settlement in the late 17th century after they were forced to flee France. Most of these families were silk weavers by trade, and very quickly they established what would become the historic center of English silk weaving, rivaling the silks produced in Lyon, France, which would be considered the very definition of luxury silk weaving in the 18th and 19th centuries. Obviously, warp-printed silk is not an easily found silk today. I particularly am head over heels in love with this silk, and I would do nothing to touch it or alter it, and this is one that I would enjoy just as it is. A little further forward in the 1850s is our third piece in this group. This circa 1855 baleen-ribbed faux-grained folding pagoda parasol with its green silk taffeta covered with satin figured stripes. The pagoda parasol in the 1850s and 60s seemed to be the favorite parasol for watering places and vacation spots. In nearly every daguerreotype I've ever seen of tourists at Niagara Falls in the 1850s, there is almost without fail someone carrying one of these pagoda parasols. They appear in wild profusion on British seaside promenades in the 1860s. I don't know why they were so common in watering places, but that's where they appear in period images. Once again, you'll never find a silk like this today. This fairly hefty, extremely crisp silk taffeta is figured by heavy use of float threads in the weave, creating satin checked bands that were placed at the top and bottom of the cover panels. A very typical orientation for stripes on original covers. This one may one day be the subject of conservation work on the cover if I ever save up the money. But one thing that will not be happening to it is it being recovered. Lastly, in our second group, we have this circa 1860 French folding ombrelle marquise carriage parasol with bone handle and elaborately woven jacquard silk cover with moire watermarking. This is an example of Lyon silk at its peak of technological prowess, and in one of my absolute favorite color combinations. It is still quite bright and vibrant as the day it came off some of the most elaborate and advanced silk weaving machines of its day. It was then run through a calendaring machine to give it the moire watermarked texture, which adds to its richness, as moire silk was itself a status symbol silk of the 1850s and 60s. Even though this silk is heavily split and the frame damaged, it is something I will never touch because it is still so beautiful.
This third group of parasols that I'm going to be going over, I have no problem recovering. These are parasols with covers that have solid color silks that with enough digging you can find modern equivalents to replace them with. The condition is important here. Split silk covers, disintegrating linings, problems with the frame that require the removal of the cover to remediate. The main thing though with these is the ability to find modern equivalent silks to replace the original silks with.
First in this group is this white painted baleen ribbed folding parasol with dolphin finial and acanthus leaf motif bone finger crook from around 1860. Moire is a silk that is harder to find today, but with enough digging you can find it. Pay attention to scale. Mid-19th century silk moires usually do not use the very narrow moire stripes most upholstery weight moires of today use. Look for file or taffeta weight silks that are moire textured instead. It requires digging, but it can be done. Second in this group is this French-made straight-handled steel-ribbed parasol from around 1870. This is a shoe-in for recovering, and a great example of how care must be taken in assessing the original cover. Red and pink dyes are notoriously fugitive in textiles, and the red dye has almost completely faded out of what was a violet color silk. Looking at the silk thread tacks on the rib tips and the silk on the tassel tells us this was originally purple, rather than the still quite pretty shade of cadet blue it is today. The frame is damaged, but repairable, and you will be seeing more of this frame in future videos. The ribbed silk taffeta is something that can be found today. With some color swatching and patience, you would be able to find something very close to the original purple color. The third example in this third group is this telescopic ebony carriage parasol with silver mounts and black silk file cover from around 1890. While the black Chantilly lace edging on this is an aftermarket edition, it is still period and quite lovely. Telescopic parasols had been popular since the end of the 1850s and continued to be manufactured into the 1890s, as their ease of use and compactness made them the ideal traveling parasol, along with the black marquise parasols that also became popular in this last decade of the 19th century. Black silk file is easily located today, as is the black silk habitai that was used in the lining. What isn't so easily found is the black Chantilly lace used to edge the piece. Thankfully, while this is still somewhat fragile and shows some damage, careful mounting onto net would stabilize it enough to remount it to a new cover. Finally, in our last group of ideal candidates for recovering is this French-made folding carriage parasol with baleen ribs made completely from clarified horn, with a terminal embedded with little brass stars. This piece dates to around 1870. Everything about this piece speaks to it being made by one of the better French parasol houses of the time, but sadly it is not marked. For recovering purposes, this is the best kind of frame to encounter. It is essentially a wild card. When no original cover survives, a parasol can be recovered without reservation, but research as to what style of cover is important, and we'll get into that later. Another group of parasols that could easily fall into this category are parasols that have been recovered and recovered really, really badly. I sadly do not have any of these available to show on camera in their state as they came to me, but I'll put some before photos as we go along here, to show how bad some of these get and why they desperately needed saving. These are my favorites to recover because I feel like I really am doing the parasol a favor for some of the awful repair jobs someone has done before me. Air quotes are not being seen here because voiceover, but I am doing them. I know their intentions were well meant, but these two examples were really painful to look at when they came to me. This circa 1855 pearl inlaid folding parasol was absolutely wrecked when it came to me. The finial had been sawn off, a broken rib was repaired, air quotes again, with a modern umbrella rib bent and bound to the baleen, and the surviving baleen ribs were whittled down with a knife and had modern metal umbrella rib tips jammed onto them. To add insult to injury, the cotton gingham cover was one of the ugliest and worst things I've ever seen put onto an original parasol. With a lot of frame rehabilitation and a new silk cover suitable to this style of frame, it now looks something like it would have looked on a spring morning in the 1850s. This second example of well-intentioned recovering gone terribly wrong is this circa 1890 telescopic parasol that had the crunchiest of craft store lace covers inflicted upon it. This was just a rectangle of crunchy lace slapped together, then gathered at the finial and glued to the rib tips. Weirdly, they left the original lining in place, but for the sake of keeping that lining intact, it was removed and stored away while a new cover and lining was put on it. This cover was styled to match original surviving telescopic parasol covers. Now, if you've watched this and determined your parasol is still one to be recovered, here are my thoughts on what I personally do when recovering. If the original cover is still remaining on the frame, take that into consideration. I do personally try to recover pieces to match their original covers, but this isn't always possible. There are some cases where I will change the color of the silk or the type of silk, but I generally try to keep it close. In some cases, dyes and trims can shift, fade, or oxidize, and the new color cover will be changed slightly to harmonize with the current color of the surviving trim. There are times, however, that I will recover a piece differently than the original cover, but in those cases, I rely on research to guide what would be an appropriate alternative style to put on that particular frame. For research, I can never repeat these three words enough for those wanting to recover. Look at originals. And to do that, look at museum collections, American, English, French. Look at eBay. Or don't look at eBay because there are parasols I need. Look at original images from the period your parasol is from. Sometimes you will find that parasol, sometimes you won't, but keep looking. And at some time I'm going to release that series of videos about parasol evolution in the 19th century to help date them. Just look at all the things, absorb all the things. All the things are helpful. I've been using all the things for 15 years and they have rarely steered me wrong. It's usually myself that steers me wrong. But anyways, there are some pieces I have actually spent years looking for just the right silk, not because I procrastinated, but because I wanted to find just the right silk for that piece. My personal goal when I recover a piece is that it looks like an original piece that has not been recovered at all. I feel I achieve that by choosing appropriate silk, appropriate colors, trims, a period correct fit, and period correct finishing techniques. And with all these, not just for the period of that parasol, but for that particular parasol and ones identical to it. I hope that this has given you some food for thought on how to approach your parasols, whether or not you decide to recover them. Or if you have ever thought about purchasing an antique piece to recover. It's really my goal to help educate people about these amazing little pieces of fashion history, and if I can help spread the love of these and bring an understanding of what went into them and how cool these things are, I feel better for it. That's the kind of thing that makes me happy. If you have enjoyed this video and want to see more parasol-related ramblings in the future, like and subscribe. I have Instagram and Facebook pages, and the links are in the description below. So if you like, you can follow me there too if it so tickles your fancy. So until next time.